So Emmanuel Ortega is the Marilyn Thomas Scholar and Assistant Professor in the Art of the Spanish Americas at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Another person I'm grateful for the length of their title. As a scholar and curator, Ortega has lectured nationally and internationally on images of auto de fe, 19th century Mexican landscape painting, and visual representations of New Mexico, or the New Mexico Puebla peoples in Nova Hispanic Franciscan martyr paintings. Springing from his research interests, Ortega has curated in Mexico and the United States, such as the exhibition Contemporary Ex Votos, Devotion Beyond Medium, opening at the New Mexico State University Art Museum. His book project is titled Visualizing Franciscan Anxiety and the Distortion of Native Resistance, the Domesticating Mission, and will be out soon, right? Next year. He is a recurrent lecturer at the Arquetopia Foundation for Development, the largest artist residency in Mexico. He'll be talking today about coordinates of Innocence, Franciscan mapping in 18th century New Spain, northern frontier. So join me in welcoming Emmanuel.
In 1810, as part of an account of expeditions to the sources of the Mississippi and through the western parts of Louisiana, American Brigadier General and explorer Zebulon Montgomery Pike published a map of the internal provinces of New Spain, aimed at exploring the southwesternmost areas of the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. Pike's second reconnaissance expedition provided critical information that would later aid in the development of the Santa Fe Trail. Acting under the orders from General-in-Chief James Wilkinson, this Jeffersonian expedition, contemporaneous with the famed Lewis and Clark journey, gained additional significance through its association with another renowned explorer, Prussian polymath Alexander von Humboldt. Pike's map of the region extracted much from Humboldt's notes, pilfering information Humboldt himself had mined from previous Spanish expeditions found in Novo Hispanic archives. Two inscriptions on Pike's maps of New Mexico are particularly relevant to this study. West of Santa Fe, one reads, Indian Smoky, independent since 1680, referencing the Pueblo Revolution that secured roughly 13 years of autonomy for the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. The transformative event alarmed colonial authorities, spurring renewed interest in the settlement administrations and exploration of the northern provinces, efforts that intensified under the Bourbon reforms in the following decades. Above this note appears another inscription. Land seen by Father Antonio Vélez de Escalante, 1777. These inscriptions derive directly from Humboldt's annotation and reflect his detailed engagement with the well-known Franciscan expedition. Escalante's reconnaissance, recognized thanks in part to Humboldt's archival investigations, is just one among many journeys undertaken by members of the Seraphic Order in the service of the Spanish crown. The cartographic lineage of empire in the United States often overlooks the contribution of devout Franciscan explorers. Escalante's reconnaissance, recognized thanks in part to Humboldt's archival investigations, is just one among many journeys undertaken by members of the Seraphic Order in service of the Spanish crown. Yet these expeditions pale in comparison to the historical and canonical recognition given to Lewis and Clark, revealing a historiographical tradition that privileges Anglo-American acts of discovery. Of equal significance is the first inscription. The anxiety that permeated this small area of New Mexico holds an almost symbolic place in the Novo Hispanic history of expansion. The principal impetus for surveying and later mapping this region was framed as a spiritual concern. Their geographical tracing are rendered here as coordinates of innocence, all created underlying anxiety surrounding native sovereignty was seldomly acknowledged. Part of my presentation and my present research aims to show how the Suñi area, renamed by the Spanish as Moqui, persisted with the cartographic Spanish administrative imagination for centuries. The area's significance was simultaneously denied, avoiding exposing the inherent flaws in the Spanish crown, failed diplomacy with resistant nomadic tribes. The case of El Moqui, its surrounding monuments, its resilient peoples, and the mapping effort that targeted serves as a troubling counterexample to the supposed linear history of Spanish imperial expansion in the Americas. The journeys laid by Fray Juan Miguel Menchero and the famed expedition of Fray Francisco Anastasio Domínguez and Fray Silvestre Vélez Escalante will serve as an anchor to analyze the larger history of Franciscan walking and mapping. Franciscan intrusion into the northern territories of New Spain, present-day U.S. Southwest, was composed by the acts of walking, discovering, erasure, renaming, mapping, and consecrating. These acts were not essential only for missionizing, but for the imperial mapping of the Southwest. Here, I articulate these acts collectively as remarking, a spatial practice of land domestication that allow vast, unknown, and seemingly deserted territories to be placed on the map. I undertake this study by analyzing several important expeditions and their resulting chronicles and visual culture. For grounding the supposed innocent impulses of the Franciscan itinerancy and the overarching role of the mission system, allow us to read the innocence embedded in each of the Brotherhood's chronicles, maps as a domesticating American project. The contradictions that this represented for every step the Brotherhood took next to secular invaders were obscured by their pastoral practices. Franciscan legacies thrive in the medieval archetype of the poor friar. Similarly to Francis' incisive 13th-century travels to spread his gospel, the 18th-century missionary friars advance an image of poverty, as noble Hispanic authorities struggle to maintain control over their northern territories against the threat of the French, English, and even the Russians. Historian Julia McClure, in her brilliant analysis of the disputes against property that preceded Franciscan presence in the Americas, points to the contradiction of a young brotherhood struggling to grow their mission at the same time they rejected the concept of property. At the general chapter of the Porciuncula in May 1219, it was agreed that there should be more commitment to St. Franciscus throughout the whole world. The global dimensions of the Franciscans often predate the journeys and discoveries that European histories traditionally focus upon. And this is one of the quotes from the book. As such, the arrival of the Franciscans to mainland America was vested with the contradictions of an imperial enterprise, conflicting with their ideologies surrounding poverty. The act of walking as a spiritual exercise is key to understand the expansion of the order throughout the continent. And here's a portrait of Fray Antonio Margil de Jesús, the unofficial patron saint of Texas, but to a certain degree, the visual and the visual culture of the Fraile Pellegrino in the 18th century, especially in the Southwest, is inaugurated by Fray Margil de Jesús. So the rest of the chronicles and expeditions after Fray Margil de Jesús follow a lot of the conventions that he establishes in the early 18th century. The act of walking as a spiritual exercise is key to understand the expansion of the order throughout the continent. According to St. Bonaventure, Francis famously declared his desire to walk around the world upon listening to the gospel in which Christ sends out his disciples to preach. Quote, "Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals or a staff." This is from Mark 10:9. Upon hearing these words, Francis expressed his desire to follow suit. Quote, "He took off the shoes from his feet, put down his staff, denounced his wallet and money, and satisfied with one tunic, threw away his leather belt, and put one piece of rope of a belt. End of quote. This act scaffolds every journey throughout the Americas and consequently every depiction, literal or pictorial, of Franciscan intrusion onto native lands. But what happens when the maintenance of that poverty by way of walking as a spiritual exercise comes at the cost of the appropriation of native land? To be more specific, how can we reconcile the fact that the activation of poverty by way of walking resulted in the Catholic consecration of land, the mapping of empire, and in the domicile of countless native groups? As struggles for native sovereignty increased in the northern provinces, the Seraphic Order revisited the mission philosophies established a century earlier. These revised tenets were disseminated through chronicles, travel journals, maps, and paintings in Franciscan education centers such as the Propaganda Fide colleges. The College of Propaganda Fide was established in Mexico, in Querétaro, in 1683, only 3 years after the Pueblo Revolution. So there's this ongoing anxiety about native resistance throughout the administration of the colonies, and this is intensified once the Bourbons arrive in the 1700s. And here's just a view of the martyr portraits that are produced as part of those movements of resistance, not only in the Southwest, but also in Central America. The image on the right is Pablo Rebullida, and he dies in the Talamanca. Also in the late 17th century. So the focus of my research is on this specific paintings, and each chapter is arranged according to a different type of portrait. But I like to show these images to give you a little bit of context that there's a large visual culture that's being created in terms of the mission system in the 18th century. So it's almost like a revived group of images and visual and literary culture that it's very similar to what happens again in the 16th century. As historian John Tutino notes, the declining mining in the Bajío, coupled with the movement of Louisiana traders deep into Texas, prompted missionary efforts to migrate even further north. Franciscans turned to the old pro-Indian vision, according to which dedicated friars, bringing trade, tools, new ways of cultivation, and Christian truth could win natives for Christianity and the Spanish regime with little force and less cost. The constant threat of the French in Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico, and the anxiety of their nomad allies culminated with the edification of presidios and missions. And one of the things that I'm arguing in the book is that what happens in the Chichimeca War, what happens in the years between 1535, roughly, all the way to 1600, trains the administrations, including the Franciscans, to deal with different nomad groups, but now later in the Southwest in the 18th century. As Spain sought to regain control over the northern territories, the intersection between this rhetoric of suffering and poverty was maintained by exploration and not by way of the medieval rhetoric of innocence, itinerancy that the surviving records indicate. In the wake of the most intense period of native resistance against royal authorities across the north, the simple act of walking was celebrated more than ever through narratives that describe the heroic perils of traversing unknown territories. The course of these acts often follows a narrative in which the struggle for native autonomy renewed interest in northern areas previously underlooked due to a perceived lack of resources. Franciscan innocence continued to shape all activity in the region, even as their activities echoed with disturbing familiarity the devastating campaigns in El Bajío almost 2 centuries earlier. And here is a view. It's interesting how I am in a cartographic conference, and I bring the most generic map I can find of the Chichimeca. But here's just a little view to give you a little context of the area that the Spanish were struggling, again, for over 70 years to take control of these spaces. And one of the things that I also argue in the book is that we always focus on the big empires, but it is the small nomad groups that continue to fight, that continue to resist, but also give this anxiety that continue all the way to the independence movements in the early 19th century. A revealing example of the Chichimeca conflict is represented by the Mapa de las Villas de San Miguel y San Felipe de los Chichimecas y el Pueblo de San Francisco. It was around 1579-1580, which displays a complex multi-directional topography marking the titular towns and settlements. As noted by historian Alberto Puig Carrasco, the depiction of small fortifications in the form of castles and church-like structures indicated the existence of presidios, or garrison posts, erected in the wake of the Mixtón or the Mixtón War around 1540-1542. Connecting all of these is a series of red lines indicating the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the Royal Inland Road, also known as the Silver Route, which led towards the richer mines of Zacatecas. While all these symbols pointed to the ever-expanded infrastructural networks that enhance imperial mobility, the clearest example of the archaeological disruptions taking shape is represented by the extensive proliferation of cattle and horses. As hinted by their overrepresentation in the map, the livestock not only displays the area's original fauna hunted by the Chichimeca. Deer and hares are depicted quite literally, displaced to the far edge of the map, alongside coyotes and wolves. Their grazing also decimated the local flora on which the Chichimeca also subsisted. This environmental disruption soon prompted the locals to resist in the form of food, clothing, and livestock theft, with some authorities complaining that the Chichimeca had developed a quote-unquote taste for beef. This later detail was not lost on the creator of the map, who inserted several scenes of the Chichimeca hunting the domesticated cattle so prized by the Spanish, an act that rendered them not only heathens, but also bandits. This is the reason why a Spanish caravan seen riding the Camino Real in the upper right of section of the composition, and you can see it around here. In the upper seen riding the Camino Real in the upper right section of the map, travels heavily armed. While not in direct confrontation with nomadic tribes, the anxiety of attack persisted, represented by roaming bands of natives who meandered through hills and behind tunales, or prickly pear cactus bushes. They are depicted stretching their bows, arrows always pointed towards the roads and ready to shoot. A particularly poignant episode is illustrated towards the bottom right of the composition. Two severe heads of Franciscan martyrs, indicated by their hair tonsors, are shown alongside the road. Their blood spills onto the demarcation red line, almost as if their sacrifice was precisely the ink used to define the roads on the map. Below the heads, who have been identified as Fray Francisco Doncel and his companion, Fray Pedro de Burgos, we read Puerto de Chamacuero, in referencing the road from which they were trapped by the Chichimecas. In the Crónica de la Orden de Nuestro Señor Seráfico San Francisco, provincia de San Pedro y San Pablo, de Michoacán en la Nueva España, which was written in 1639 by Fray Alonso de la Rea, we see one of the earliest examples of hagiographic writing in New Spain and one of the few novel Hispanic chronicles produced during this century. The author narrates with singular explicitity the events surrounding the deaths of the two friars. Going down the Chamacuero Pass, 2 leagues from the town of San Miguel, along a very deep stream that flows from the highlands, many Chichimecas came out of ambush with bows and arrows, shouting and yelling and attacking the two religious. They found Father Doncel kneeling with Christ in his hands, preaching his doctrine to them, and his companions at his side. And like voracious wolves and Hyrcanian tigers, they tore them to pieces, their innocent blood being food for their fury, leaving Father Doncel dead, with Christ embraced on his knees and his companion not far off. This episode shows early signs of future missionary interventions. More specifically, the narrative style of this hagiography and the blood serve as a boundary between civilized territory and the wilderness, not only producing two martyrs, but also opening the way for future successful missions, as we will see in their activities in New Mexico and Arizona 200 years later. The inclusion of this martyr episode demonstrates the anxiety surrounding mobility, a common trope in documents related to this conflict, thus highlighting both the obstacle that the Spanish forces faced along the silver mine routes and the ease with which the Chichimeca defended their territories. The great danger of Chichimeca resistant fronts consisted not in the violence they represented to imperial life, but on the obstacle their fierce resilience represented for the expansion and economic prosperity of the empire. This map reveals the secular apprehensions towards the indomitable Chichimeca, a challenge they entrusted to religious orders. Risking the prosperity of the global silver trade, the Chichimeca were seen as only an obstacle. Now we come back to the 18th century. So since the 16th century, the Franciscans conducted several campaigns into the northern provinces of New Spain, attempted to control Hopi settlements and other nomadic tribes. The anxiety that reigned for several decades is palpable in Fray Juan Menchero's 1745 map, crafted to accompany his expedition notes from 1744. Dedicated to Viceroy Juan Francisco de Güemes y Orcasitas, as a plea to expand mission in the hostile region, the lower left cartouche, partly framed by the formulaic figure of a nomad Indian, reads as follows. Personal work that Reverend Father Fray Juan Miguel Menchero had in this short inspection as Visitador General de la Nuevo Mexico, as he dedicates to His Excellency Señor Don Juan Francisco Güemes y Orcasitas, Viceroy, Governor, and General Captain of New Spain, with the purpose of having Its Excellency increase protection of these missions. The map illustrates the area surrounding the Rio del Norte, today Rio Grande, and emphasizes the intense Franciscan activity throughout the region. A series of encounters with nomad tribes, congregation scenes, and other hagiographic episodes are spread throughout this complex document. Notably, the map is marked by the collective figures of naked nomads, who more accurately roam between the provinces of Navajo and Moqui. Fray Menchero produced this map while on appointment as a Visitador General to the area, initiating a series of expeditions that sought to find, quote, peace on the immediate frontier, a safe direct route between Sonora and New Mexico, and a restoration of the isolated Provincia del Moqui. This map features two important events that attest to the larger Franciscan preoccupation. First, and this is hard to read in this image, in the upper middle section, a text tracing the flow of the Dorado River reads, quote, here Frenchmen killed the soldiers from the Villa of Santa Fe, end of quote. This is making a clear reference to the failed Pedro de Villasur expedition of 1720. The martyrdom of Fray Juan Domínguez, who accompanied the expedition, was also famously illustrated in the much-studied and celebrated Segeser hide paintings. The literal blood shed upon the land imprinted the landscape depicted, helping commemorate the brothers' heroic intrusion upon native land. Immortalized by way of chronicles and maps, such as Menchero's, their bodily inscription, both literal, textual, and metaphorical, aim to operate as coordinates, delineating the difference between Catholic and native territories, a warning of the hostile territories yet to be converted and the possible consequences of such enterprises. These encounters culminate in the second event, a pictorial hagiographic scene on the middle left border of the map showing a band of Jijime natives attacking two Jesuit priests. The text accompanying this miniature scene reads, "Here the Jijime Indians attacked the Jesuit father, killing a soldier." This episode commemorates Father Ignacio Keller's attempt to establish a mission in what today is southern Arizona. The documentation of these two events demonstrates the investment in finalizing the subjugation of this entire area, which had created conflict to the viceregal authorities once again since the Pueblo Revolution of 1680. The Franciscan intervention interests and settled colonial places are crowned with the symbols that adorn the upper borders of the map. In the far right, the top cartouche is decorated with a stylized string of pendant bodies. This ornate design features the figure of a Franciscan in speaking manner, opening his arms to the interlocked figures of formulaic barbarians cascading downwards. Four semi-nude native figures, a man, two women, and a child, are depicted in a manner that viscerally connects them to the friar through a congregational gesture. This reinforces the map's intent, suggesting that their salvation depends on the friar's preaching and paternalistic actions. All these pictorial flourishes are deployed to frame an itemized list of villas, presidios, and missions. The remarked coordinates of Franciscan innocent and seal, that is, martyr sites, renamed geological formation, missions, and seemingly peaceful encounters between Europeans and native groups may lack the scientific rigor common in maps of this period, but they are equally anchored by imperial approval. In the upper center of the composition, we see the coat of arms of the city of Toledo, which was a gift from Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. The shield features the medal of the Golden Fleece as its base, commemorating the foundation of the Catholic chivalric order established by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy in Bruges in 1430 to celebrate his marriage to Isabella of Portugal. To complete this decorative trinity, the map displays a symbol of the Franciscan order at the top left border. These three illustrations, along with the compass rose placed along the hanging fleece, help rearrange the scattered coordinates of Franciscan innocence into a cartographic representation of empire. They establish the intentions of the Seraphic order in these northern regions, which their influence had spanned for more than a century. Finally, the decorative borders help demarcate the frontiers of the ever-changing wilderness. In 1776, a royally appointed expedition led by Fray Francisco Anastasio Domínguez and Fray Silvestre Vélez Escalante aimed to find a route between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the missions of California, with the notion that the Franciscans will establish further mission outposts along the route, labeled by many as a failed expedition, since it never accomplished its goal of finding an overland route to the port of Monterrey in California. Its reconnaissance of the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, greatly influenced later surveying excursions. The unstable conditions of the Hopi region were just one of many central concerns for the expedition during this period. Prior to the Spanish expedition of Escalante, which was a decades-long pastoral effort with the Hopi, he recorded all of that in a diary that reached the Viceroy Antonio Maria de Bucareli Ursúa, influencing future mediations in the zone. The isolated region was marked by discontent and conflict. Not only it had produced several martyrs during the Revolution of 1680, but it also laid outside Spanish control due to concerns that a war with the Hopi would send the wrong message to neighboring nomadic tribes. Maintaining peaceful relations with groups like the Navajo and the Utes was essential for further expansion. A report sent to military leader Don Hugo O'Connor by Don Francisco Antonio Crespo, governor of Sonora, in November of 1775, warned against Escalante's bellicose recommendation to subdue the Hopi. It will be feared that the consequences will be disastrous, he mentions. For if these three tribes form an alliance, they will very soon finish off the kingdom, and could keep us very busy. They could keep us as busy as the Apaches Guilefios do now. Escalante explorations into the Hopi region resulted in a report that planned his recommendations to end the long-lasting independence of these groups. And I just want to frame that the following quote is very similar to some of the initial counseling of the Franciscans to finish the Chichimeca conflict by way, they call it, of blood and fire. This is one of the quotes, and it's a very famous quote. It is falsely stated that they are docile people ready for reduction, and they will be more easily subdued by gentle methods than by subjecting them first. God indeed knows that my only purpose is that His Majesty be better served and worshipped where He is insulted and outraged. There is no need for me to represent to your paternity how important any possible activity in this matter is to the greater glory of God. The report also produced a cartographic chart of Hopi settlement, which contrasts with most of the 18th century Novo-Hispanic map production. The document lacks all markings of Franciscan innocence. Instead, it zeroes in on data useful to subjugate the region. Aside from several glyphs of mountains and mesoformations, the map only includes links between sites visited by Escalante and the number of families that each pueblo contained. These estimates were also recorded in his report, which details the resistant and amicable approach to Hopi leaders. No decorative elements, no signs indicating a longer history of Spanish and Franciscan settlements, nor memorialization of battles or encounters. Instead, this is terra incognita, and it remains free from symbols of intrusion. Its somber and bare nature demonstrates not only a land in need of Spanish colonial interference, but more importantly, a resilient and protected space whose impervious nature was the locus of administrative anxiety. Several maps were also produced after the journey, and most of them were made by Mieri Pacheco. However, I want to concentrate on one specific one by Escalante. The Derrotero was created as an extension to the expedition's chronicles. A red line connected a series of names corresponding to campsites and natural formations, all of which are mentioned in his diary. The cartouche is framed by two figures of formulaic nomads, ubiquitous in much of the Franciscan visual culture. One is standing along the left section of the dedication, while another lays with his leg extended, creating a half frame between both figures. They are positioned along a semi-bare landscape, indicating the wild nature of both unconquered lands and natives. The text reads, "Route map made by Antonio Vélez y Escalante, missionary, for improved knowledge of the missions, Indian pueblos, and garrisons found on the road from Monterrey to Santa Fe, New Mexico." The Domínguez Escalante journey also indicates the places they name along their way. In fact, the points of interest that connect the red line, which are pinpointed by way of small churches, were mostly named by Escalante. Take, for instance, the bottom right of the map, which depicts areas traversed in late October, and this is from his chronicle. On the 20th, we set out from San Manuel towards the northeast, directing our way to the ford of El Rio Colorado. We named this place Santa Gertrudis, observing its latitude by the North Star, which is 36 degrees and 3 that. Curiously, this scientific perspective is lost from the map. Instead, Escalante ensured to mention all the places that nombramos, that we name, without specifying the distances and position that the journal indicates. The expedition exerted an imperative over the land to remark every stop, displaying the intentions of the map. The map's quote-unquote redlining is punctuated by small churches like knots in a Franciscan rope, and serves to delineate once unknown territory, wilderness, into Catholic branded or consecrated land. Like many maps of the period, the edges of the drawn terrain fade out with the inscription Territorio Desconocido, or unknown territory, or the names of tribes yet to be fully subdued, reflecting the anxiety surrounding the lack of diplomatic ties with certain groups. These remarkings serve as cautionary notes and call for further colonization. Returning to Zebulon's Pike map and its inscriptions, we can now better discern the violence these markings represents, particularly in light of Franciscan itinerancy and their presumed innocence. As noted, Moqui independence, always positioned outside the coordinates of innocence, was fueled by 2 centuries of resistance, beginning with the initial wars of subjugation. From the Chichimeca War to the countless revolts and uprisings that culminated in the Pueblo Revolution, the anxiety over native sovereignty continued to reverberate across the northern territories. The role of Franciscan itinerancy in this context lies in how the spiritual interventions produce more legible and legitimate coordinates for imperialism. This began with Spanish Enlightenment concerns in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, and later evolved to serve the westward expansionist agendas of the United States. Pike's maps reflect both the consequences and contributions of these Franciscan acts of domestication in the Southwest. However, as noted before, Pike's work relied heavily on Humboldt's mapping, which also influenced the future expansionist endeavors of the United States. This remains a subject of ongoing debate. Namely, what role did Humboldt's work played in the shaping the course of empire? On June 9 of 1804, President Thomas Jefferson wrote to Humboldt requesting a report of the southern border, which he mistakenly believed, due to a misreading of an ambiguous clause in the Louisiana Purchase Agreement, extended as far north as the Rio Bravo, the presumed southern boundary of the newly acquired territory. The annotations of this map, visible all throughout its southwestern portion, corresponds to the imperative anxieties and desires that Franciscans first began to express by way of their post-Pueblo Revolution pilgrimages. The Moqui continued to be mapped as an enigma following Escalante's journey, with Humboldt's annotation stating how the area was, quote, unknown country between the Yaquecilla and the Rio Gila, that is, uncharted, unconsecrated, and undomesticated territory. The influence of Humboldt's map on the U.S. reconnaissance of the southwestern lands planted the first seed that allowed for the growing empire to envision its borders to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The initial geographical envisioning into the true expansive areas the Franciscan friars first traversed in the name of their innocence. The role of the Franciscans in this ideological lineage is often overlooked, partly because canonical U.S. history has marginalized the Southwest within the broader narrative of national identity. Furthermore, the perceived innocence of both Humboldt and the itinerant missionaries is often evaluated in terms of their intentions, effectively erasing their complacency. Discussions about Humboldt frequently, for instance, focus on archival letters and writings that express his lack of support of the inevitable upcoming Mexican-American War, overlooking both the weight of his geographical intel to Thomas Jefferson and the broader agency embodied in his scientific expeditions across the Americas. As art historian Michael Baxendale reminds us, intention is not an innate artistic psychological state from which an object simply emerges. Rather, it must be understood within the framework of circumstances that shape the process of creation. Baxendale urges us to consider agency as embedded in these broader conditions rather than isolated impersonal motive. Thus, while Humboldt's quote-unquote noble intentions may have advocated for alternatives to the eventual course of the Mexican-American War, his role as a royal agent tasked with surveying colonized American lands for economic exploitation, ultimately contributed to a body of cartographic intelligence that made the ideology of manifest destiny appear not only inevitable, but materially attainable. Similarly, the perceived innocence of the Franciscans suggests a virtuous mission, seemingly untouched by the violence of extermination that characterized much of Spanish colonization. Yet, their agency as emissaries of both the crown and the church directly contributed to the domesticating movements and procedures that structured this analysis. While the early 18th century missionary itinerancy in the deserts and borderlands of the U.S. Southwest may seem temporarily distant from the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico, we must not lose sight of the bloodline of innocence agency that connects these actors across history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let's take some questions.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. That was beautiful, and especially being able to kind of follow this trajectory and thinking about Humboldt, someone who is kind of internationally famous, bringing that into the Southwest is really compelling. I love all of the research and the work you've done around developing these ideas around the significance of walking, specifically to the Franciscans, and how that connects to these kind of ideals of vows of poverty. But it also somehow makes them civilized, right? And perhaps it's because it's connected to cartography. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, like, why is walking civilized when it's Franciscans, but then when it's indigenous people, you have like wandering or like naked nomads?
Yeah, it's one of the contrasts that I talk a little bit about in the book. Walking for the Franciscans. Let me put my glasses because all I see is pixels. There you are. Hi. Walking for the Franciscans was a physical manifestation of a journey towards God. And this is something that is always manifested from Franciscan rules of the 1200s, and a lot of writings of theologians that follow the law of St. Francis are constantly talking that the life of a Franciscan towards poverty is supposed to be envisioned by a journey. The spiritual exercises of San Ignacio de Loyola also were very influential in the idea of attaining this sort of imitatio Christi in relation to the idea of journeying, of walking. So that's why all of these movements towards the Southwest, which I need to mention that the Franciscans were sort of like a way to test the stability of this area. So they're the first ones to arrive. They check that everything is okay. They create these chronicles, emphasizing the spiritual journey that walking represents, but really is the idea of starting a new movement of domestication for the Spanish to later continue. And yes, and this is also very interesting because as they walk, they rename and they erase native trails. So the idea of the contrast of walking in relationship to the anxiety of roaming as opposed to the spiritual exercise of journeying, it's the contrast that I emphasize in the book. So for the Franciscans, that's specifically what it is. Larger context of other brotherhoods or larger theological questions, not so much, but I focus on these very Franciscan ideas. I hope I answered the question. Awesome, okay.
Hi, we're staying here. Thank you, I really found this so fascinating. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about how the sort of late 18th century Franciscans are connecting to the 16th century, because it's a long period of time, and you sort of alluded to continuity, but I'm wondering how self-conscious they are about revisiting and either reenacting or revising. And part of what is guiding my thinking is that in a different context, but is exactly contemporaneous, that of natural history explorations, right? So is different, but it also has to do with mapping, with charting, with making visible. There is a very self-conscious idea in the 1770s that this is a moment of risk, of decline, of fragility imperially, and that to look back 200 years to the 1570s, which is seen as like a glorious moment, is to sort of reactivate, right? So they don't see a continuity, they see a huge rupture, and they're like, now we're going to go back to doing what we did before, right? And they start describing themselves as botanical conquistadors, right? They're like, we have to go back to those glory days. So how are the Franciscans who are doing this seeing themselves vis-a-vis, you know, they had such a strong discourse of when they first came, they were the first order in New Spain, and of what they were up to.
They're aware, and it's everything. I think there's like a larger study, I always tell my students, this is a dissertation. I think of, for example, of San Gabriel Cholula and San Gabriel in California. I walk in California, I walk in Cholula. There's so many similarities in the layout. The Franciscans are thinking about the glorious golden missionizing period. One of the things I explore in the book is the role of the Chichimeca and nomad groups in that era by way of Valadez. Valadez trains in Zacatecas. Valadez trains with Juan Focher in the northern. So when they arrive to the southwest, they already have books, they already have an entire school of how to deal not necessarily with indigenous folks, but with nomad groups. And it's interesting because we always think of the 17th century as an existential crisis for the Franciscans. Not much is going on. Only a couple of chronicles are produced in Mexico in the 17th century. But the literary and visual rhetoric is start being constructed in Europe. In Europe, they're making sense of everything that happened in the 16th century. So for example, images like the martyr images that I show, all that visual rhetoric is constructed by Orcelar, for instance, is constructed by various Franciscans in Europe in the 17th century that are starting to make sense of the monumental movements of missionizing that occurred in Mexico. So I am slowly stopping myself from thinking of the 17th century as a dead stop of the mission system. It's almost like a reckoning period, and they come back in the 18th century in full force. And I would even compare that the activities, and you see it by way of the visual culture that survives, by all the chronicles that produce, and then on top of that, by maps, which maps, they're not as common in the 16th century in relation to the Franciscans. I will even argue that the 18th century was not only a renewed 16th century efforts, but they went even above and beyond everything they learned from people like from all the 12 Franciscans, not to name every single one of them. So yeah, I think they're very aware, and you see it in the paintings, you see it in the narrative style of the chronicles, you see it in the architecture of the missions of the Southwest. It's absolutely everywhere. So they're highly, highly aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, when the Franciscans get there, and I'm assuming 1700s, I'm going to talk out of ignorance here, but I'm curious, how many tribes have they identified that were in the area in those maps that you're showing? And are they at war, and is that something that the Franciscans would have like exploited, the different animosities between the tribes, like Cortez did when he invaded Mexico?
I don't know specific numbers, but in terms of New Mexico, because the exploration started in the 16th century as well, with the idea of the 7 cities of Chivola and the gold and everything they were supposed to find, there was always an interest by the Spanish authorities to know exactly the specifics of that area. What's fascinating is that the impulses in the Chichimeca area were all about mining, were all about silver. Those resources do not exist in New Mexico, but the French and the English are coming. So they are sort of changing a little bit of that. But if you notice in all of the maps produced in the 18th century, there's always the desert lands. And then New Mexico along the Rio Grande names all of the different tribes because they have specific knowledge of them because they're sedentary. The Spanish named them pueblos because they are like towns, as opposed to the rest of different groups around the area, Apaches, Comanches, which Laila spoke about. They concentrate on missionizing in the pueblo areas because they are able to, because they can recognize their cities, because they recognize their civilizations. Their congregational and their pastoral attempts, as they were trained in the 16th century, are perfectly applicable for the Pueblo people, but not for the rest of the Southwest. So they have full knowledge of all the Pueblos, full knowledge of all the different groups. But when it comes to the other ones, that's where the anxiety comes in. That's where the anxiety of not knowing the territory well enough as the Apache did, or the Comanche did. So many times they just label Apacherias, a big piece of land, when in reality we're talking about maybe 10 groups within that area that they focus on the maps. So again, I will say that most of their knowledge, especially 16th, 17th century, it's limited to the pueblos along the Rio Grande and slowly to the rest of the Southwest. But I don't have numbers, yeah. Mm-hmm. Barbara.
Thank you for this fabulous paper, beautifully illustrated and argued. Years ago, Jose Rabasa wrote about how in the colonization project that hate speech is always combined with love speech.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, because you've done so much research on this, could you pull out an example of this kind of twining of love speech and hate speech in the Franciscan enterprise, and what that means for cartography?
That's a really good question. Okay, this is gonna sound bad, but I read all of Franciscan speech as hate speech. All of it. I was trained to focus on impact as opposed to intention, so I cannot unsee. So when you start, when we start understanding the principal tenets of the Franciscans by way of the medieval church, when you think about congregational push, when you think of pastoral push is full of this flowery language that focus on the ideas one-on-one congregational practices. The Franciscans are always seen as innocents because they create like La Iglesia Indiana, right? In the early 20th century, the movements of educations in Mexico look back at La Iglesia que construyeron los franciscanos for that. But again, that's precisely the impact. The first chapter, which I dropped from the book, but I'm thinking of an essay, and it's something that has been studying a little bit more, is how they focus on children. The first martyrs of Mexico were los niños de Tlaxcaltecas, for instance. And that language, it's filled with paternalistic flourishes everywhere you looked at. But the consequences of utilizing children, which go back to Savonarola days in Italy, have terrible consequences in the Indian schools of the United States and Canada. That is the main idea behind using the idea of slow violence. That instead of focusing on this like flowery and beautiful and paternalistic language, I focus on the impact and what happens 200-300 years later. We're still dealing with the consequences of those pastoral and congregational movements. So the consequences to that onto the land are shown by way of, we don't have longitude lines, we don't have latitude lines. Instead, we have blood. So this is how we're going to mark the territory. From here to Arizona, there were 2 martyrdoms. So from here to Arizona is safe territory. And the language of martyrdom is the language of innocence. And the language of martyrdom is part of this sort of like love speech, because they die for the love of God, but also for the love of converting natives. So everything. Yeah. Thank you, Barbara.
We have one question from the Zoom. Do you have an assessment of the conflicts between various religious orders, obviously the Franciscans and the Jesuits, and the conflicts between religious orders and kind of secular governments? Or
no, I don't have a lot of information, a lot of research on that. But what I do know is that the visual rhetoric of martyrdom that you see in the 18th century many times is borrowed from the Jesuits. A lot of these images. I will even argue, and there's many studies, there's many scholars that work on this, that the Jesuits actually are pushing even more to show an image of innocence in relation to martyrdom. And the images are so much more gruesome, for instance, than the ones that I've been able to find with the Franciscans. So there's a little bit of a competition to see who produces more martyrs in the fastest way throughout the colonial period. And you can see those conflicts in relationship to the iconography, but I'm not necessarily too versed on sort of the theological battles that were happening between the different orders and the secular at this time.
Another Zoom question, which is lengthier, so I'll do my best. They say it's a very powerful presentation, and thank you. With these hagiographic portraits in mind, in spite of any settler anxieties of violence from Chichimecas, during this time we know there's widespread slave raiding campaigns taking place to capture Chichimeca women and children for indentured servitude. They're curious were there any systems for forced labor captured on any of the maps you haven't investigated, and how does the presence or lack of visual information about those kind of slavery and indentured servitude uphold settler violence?
It's not reflected in the maps, but precisely and that pertains to Barbara's question, all of that, the forced labor, the push towards, for example, one of the things that I focus with the Chichimeca is that at the beginning in the Third Mexican Council, before the Third Mexican Council, they're pushing towards a total war against the Chichimeca, and they quickly changed their tune. And in the Third Mexican Council, they're arguing that they need to stop. It needs to be peaceful. The consequences of that is the congregations, which are taking the nomad groups into one single settlement, divorcing them from their former identities in the Altepetls, and pushing them to different forms of labor. So again, the language of forced labor and enslavement, it's veiled by way of congregational impulses or congregational processes. And there's also a visual culture related to that, and it's always about the portrait of the Franciscans. But the Franciscans, the second they arrive to Mexico, they're creating a legacy when there's not even a legacy yet. From the day one, they have portraits of the first mythical 12 Franciscans. So we have to think of the legacy of pushing this idea of promoting themselves. Always, always, always promotion. And especially in the 18th century, the Jesuits get kicked out in 1767. So they are scared. So they have to push for all of this visual culture, chronicles, maps, everything to show that they're not only soldiers of God, but they're also soldiers of empire.
One question I have too is how I'm thinking of some of these portraits, and what came to mind is the map of the Philippines we have from the 1740s with the crab martyr. I think I forget exactly what, but it's a kind of miracle of them riding a crab to save them from a shipwreck. But I'm curious how the representations of these Franciscan martyrs compares to how they're representing martyrs in other parts of the world.
Yeah, in fact, the very first images to start circulating globally in relationship to martyrdom are the Nagasaki martyrs. They're the ones that are happening in Asia. What happened in Nagasaki was, to quote Laila, was the biggest chisme of the 16th century. It traveled everywhere, and when you go to the archives, when you go to the Franciscan libraries in Mexico, you're gonna have 2, 3, 4 copies of Felipe de Jesús biographies. So it's very latent. For example, these images that you see right here, the one on the right and the one on the left, they're both from, this is from Querétaro, but the one on the left is from Zacatecas. And these are housed in propaganda fide colleges in rooms that showcase these important people of the mission system. And you always are going to see images of San Felipe de Jesús. You're always going to see Nagasaki martyr portraits alongside the new martyrs. And there's images that are produced in the 16th century, and then they later produced in the 18th century by way of a renewed iconography that was produced in Europe in the printed culture in the 17th century. It's all a continuation. Yeah. You have to press the button.
Is that better? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
When the Franciscans arrived in the 1700s, did slavery exist as an idea in Indian culture, either Comanche, Navajo, or Apache?
All of the legal disputes about the human integrity of native folks in Mexico are based on Aristotelian rhetoric about who is the master and who is the slave. So they're fully aware of that. And in fact, there's a lot of quotes from Faucher that speak specifically, and Faucher is the person that trained Valadez. So he's creating one of the first printed mission booklets, if you want to call it like that. And he mentions these ideas over and over and over again. It's the right of the prince of the empire to enslave its people, because that's going to create peace later on the road. So it's the rhetoric of enslavement, it's front and central from the second the Spanish arrived in the Americas, absolutely. Yeah. If they did, it wasn't in the same ideological plane as the Spanish. It must have been very different. But there's hierarchies in all groups. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Emmanuel.